Hello, this is Laurel Farrer again. Thank you so much again for joining the Pluralsight team and I recently for the long distance leadership webinar in which we talked about remote work and how it influences and impacts our methodologies and habits as managers. It was a really great discussion. In fact, it was so great that we had so many Q&As that were not answered. We figured we'd supplement the webinar with this additional video to help answer those leftover questions. So I hope that this is useful, and if just in case you had a question that wasn't answered and you were disappointed, hopefully this lifts your spirits. There's lots of great questions to answer here, so let's go ahead and jump into it. Let's start with one from Noel, who says, I find I need some sort of separation. I have a dedicated office area set up when I work from home, but when I'm there, I'm at work, and when I'm not there, I'm at home. Otherwise, I feel like I'm never away from work. This is a really important point. Thank you for bringing it up, Noel. Like we talked about in the webinar, burnout is incredibly common in remote workers. We're always toggling between work and home and work and home and work and home, all while in the same space. And so psychologically, that's exhausting, but it also creates this always on mentality. So like you said, it is very important to draw boundaries. However, if you find that the boundaries of working in a specific space aren't quite enough for you, it's also helpful to remember that our brains are all completely different, and the boundaries that work for one person might not work for another. So there's a variety of ways that we can draw boundaries for ourselves, and some are going to work for different types of personalities. A very common one is that space, that dedicated workspace. So geographically, you're drawing a separation between where you are. You only work in a specific area of your home, and you only relax in a specific area of your home. So you're not blurring the lines between like working in bed and working on the couch, because that way when you sit down on a couch, your brain is saying, oh, it's time to work, right? Like that's not what we want. So that is probably the most common and the most effective way for people to draw those boundaries. However, there's lots of other boundaries that people draw. Some people have a routine that gets them in and out of work mode. Like, I'm going to go for a run, I'm going to listen to a podcast, drink a cup of coffee, and then I'm going to sit down to work. And then I don't stop working until I've done a similar wind down routine. So kind of replacing the mentality of a commute and having that buffer zone of time and headspace in between the two types of activities. Other people separate with like a device, and they only work on one device and only play on a different device. Other people have certain music that they only listen to during work. The point is, there's a lot of different options. It's important for you to take time and figure out which boundaries your brain most responds to, because it's going to be unique for each person. So take the time to explore a lot of different options and figure out which boundaries are the most effective for you to separate work and life even while in the same space. The next question is from Andrew. He asks, what is the comment about it being illegal to respond to email at 2 a.m.? Great question. So this is a great reminder that legislation and rules and regulations about remote work do not exist yet, and there's going to be a lot of catching up to do. So there's a lot of boundaries, like we were talking about, a lot of boundaries that are not enforced yet but need to be and will be in the future. The reason that we know that this is coming is because they've started to roll out a little bit. For example, in the state of New York, there are laws about when employers can responsibly require their employees to respond to emails and when they can't. So in short, they made it illegal for employers to require that employees respond to emails at 2 a.m. in the morning. That was just the tip of the iceberg. We will continue to see more regulations and more laws roll out to help protect employers and protect employees in work-life separation. Next is, you mentioned Teams is rolling something out soon. Can you elaborate on what that is and when? Yes. So we were talking at the time about wellness and how to kind of gauge the emotional needs of your employees when you can't see them. And Microsoft Teams is rolling out a feature. I believe it is Q1 or Q2 of 2021. They've already announced that they're already testing it in some areas. So it might be available on your 365 if you are a Microsoft user. But it is a lot of functionality and tools about wellness. So they've created a partnership with Headspace to help with that work-life separation. They've integrated small functionality like, click on the happy face, click on the sad face, if based on how you're feeling today. That competes with products like 15.5, Culture Amp, Tiny Pulse, that gives us that visibility into how our teams are doing with an asynchronous tool. Microsoft, because Microsoft was a remote friendly team prior to the pandemic, and they've only become more of a distributed team internally since then, they are really savvy on the needs of distributed teams. And so they are rolling out functionality like crazy. So if you want to deep dive into their roadmap, you can just go Google it and find it on their website. They've got some really great features coming up for remote workers. Next, how can individual contributors work effectively in an environment where a leader doesn't understand these concepts? Now, this is hard, and I understand that in an ideal world, we would like the entire company to convert all at the same time and for everybody to be on the same page, but realistically, that's not always possible. So I do understand that this happens, and at the key and the core of this scenario is really to remember the core of remote work in general, which is this is a shift to the autonomy and self-management of the workforce. Even if your boss was fully supportive, your shift to remote work would represent more responsibility on you as an employee, that you've got to take more ownership for your accountability, for your discipline, for your productivity. So that is something that you can adopt with or without your boss. And you can say, I'm going to be more of a self-manager so that I can earn the right of flexibility if and when that boss does come around into understanding the benefits of remote work. So you can prepare yourself and proactively earn more trust from your employer by implementing what we call a remote first mindset. And that is just operating the same way in an office as you would out of an office, and vice versa. So that creates the space for location irrelevancy, that you are just as productive, just as accountable, just as creative, no matter where you are, and you're not dependent on a specific location. The more that you can be building those habits now, the more that you can prove how viable it is later on. All right. Next, any recommendations for someone starting as a new employee or consultant into a totally remote environment and one that wasn't before? I would kind of answer it the same way that I did with the last question. Just focus on that self-management. Focus on the fact that you are now responsible for yourself. You are not dependent on your coworkers to motivate you, to inspire you. You need to think more critically by yourself. You just have more responsibility than you may be used to. Sometimes that's a good thing, sometimes it's a bad thing, but focus on that. Focus on, am I responsible for my own time, my own tasks, my own energy? Am I in control of all of those things? The more that you focus on that realm of independence, the more that you will be successful as a remote worker. All right, next, what should be the expectations of companies to support workers from home? Examples, they used to provide a desk phone computer. Now, this is a great example of how legislation and requirements do not exist yet, but they will very soon. As of right now, employers are not required to provide anything. However, what I anticipate the future being is that any equipment that is absolutely required to access work resources. So laptop, webcam, maybe phone, probably internet. Those will need to be either provided or partially compensated for by the employer. Everything else, really nice webcams and ring lights and external keyboards and great setups, right? Like everything else, that's going to depend on the employer. We'll probably see growth in that area as employers start to compete with each other for remote talent. They will start to offer more benefits and more perks for remote workers and say like, oh, we provide a $2,000 home office stipend, whereas our competitors don't. So we'll probably see growth in that area just as a competitive advantage, but they won't be required to for a while. The short answer is they're not required to now, but companies should. Oh, ergonomic chair. I would also add that to the list. That's probably going to be required as well, because that's another area that has a lot of catching up to do is occupational safety and health. All right, next, remote work can add delays to technical teams as you lose the benefits of water cooler chat. How can we foster conversation to brainstorm with remote work? So this was a question from Selen. We also had similar questions from Jonathan and Tashara and Steve, all asking the same things about how do we foster conversation? We are going from this environment where we had access to each other all day, every day. We got to hang out together. We had such great culture and bonding opportunities. And then we go to this environment where we're just sitting alone all day, every day. How do we cope? How do we adjust? That is a really, really great question. The mistake that a lot of leaders make when they're thinking about this question is, well, that's frivolous. That's not work. We don't need to worry about that, right? However, as a former operations manager, I will be the first to raise my hand and say that interpersonal relationship development within the workforce is absolutely essential to efficiency and output. I like to say that if you can't talk about puppies, you can't talk about profit. And so that is absolutely critical in high pressure environments to understand how to work with each other and know the nuances and quirks of each other's communication styles. So in fully distributed companies, we do still make time for these interpersonal activities. They are really, really important. So this is also, I'm going to kind of segue into talking about what that looks like in terms of activities, which is an answer to Dean's question, as well as an anonymous asker who said, can you give us some examples of what culture development looks like? So yes, it's important. What that looks like is the limit is your imagination, right? So there are any number of things. You can just Google it and find so many examples. TaxJar has like a Great British Bake Off spin-off where everybody bakes their own birthday cake and then they all do a virtual competition with photos and video. There are people that produce hilarious videos in light of an all hands. That's Help Scout. There's companies that take it like way down and it's not as fun and frilly. It's very structured. And so they just have like culture development meetings, or they'll have bio decks. GitLab is famous for their bio deck in which everybody has a personal README page of like, this is what it's like to work with me, get to know me. A lot of companies use Donut as an app, which is, it kind of replicates spontaneous hallway conversations in which you're just randomly paired with somebody else from your workforce. And you just get together and talk about anything other than work. There are so many ideas out there, but you shouldn't limit yourself on just what you can find on Google. Use your imagination and think, what would be fun? What am I hungry for? What would represent the culture of our company? And use your imagination and think of new activities. It is absolutely 100% possible to build trust and very, very sincere relationships with people that you haven't met in person or that you only get to see once a month or maybe once a quarter. So it's definitely possible. at the root of the solution is to, number one, create time and space for it, and number two, to open yourself up to it. If everybody is closed off and thinking this is stupid, I don't want to participate, then you're not going to get anything out of it. So if you can ask your team to kind of let their guard down or participate in the planning, so it's something that they're excited about, the more engagement you'll see and the better results you'll see. All right, moving on to onboarding. We had a couple of questions, one from Keith and one from Jacob, about how to, once we create this engaging virtual culture, how do we welcome people into it? How do we create that experience of mentorship and guidance for people who need more hand-holding or introductions? This is a great time to remember that we don't really need to reinvent the wheel. Consider your old onboarding process and just break it down into little pieces and say, okay, what did they do in onboarding on site? They were signing papers, they were participating in a training program, they were getting introduced to key players in the team, and they were getting to know their team. Well, convert each of those elements into virtual pieces and create a great getting to know you party for the team and department to get to know this new team member. They can still observe the operations of the company by joining in on meetings and shadowing on different calls and conferences. They can and absolutely should be assigned a mentor that checks in with them throughout the day and saying, how are you doing? And that's going to be a mixture of messages as well as calls. There's going to be opportunities for them to be introduced to executives and leadership, and just schedule a meeting to do that, or have a one-to-one conversation with them and each member of the team. It's not going to happen organically because they're not just walking around the office, but that doesn't mean that it can't happen. You just have to intentionally create the time and space for those to happen, just like culture development. So just think about it happening in different channels, but it still absolutely happens. No questions asked. We in distributed companies, we take onboarding very, very seriously. The only other tip that I would add to that is that communication is really critical. You might remember me saying from the webinar that in remote work, over communication is just communication. This is a great example of that we really need to articulate the elements of our culture and the expectations of performance that traditionally they used to observe. Right? So observation is a communication channel, and now we just need to use a different communication channel, like a handbook or a mentor or somebody that's going to articulate exactly what is expected of them and what is not. So workflows, processes, etiquette in Slack or Teams, how to draw boundaries for yourself, what expectation are around response times, all of those need to be articulated and communicated to them because they won't have the opportunity to observe. Other than that, onboarding is just like it used to be. Next is from John. Can you provide some guidance on the best way to deal with performance issues in a work from home environment? Again, we don't need to reinvent the wheel. So if you are having performance issues, you probably want to implement the same disciplinary process that you used to in the office. Probably start with a one-to-one to identify barriers to success and what's going on, how are things going, is there anything I can do to help, and then continue to escalate from there. However, in order to prevent those from happening, I would take a step back and really focus on key performance indicators. Key performance indicators are literally the conversation where you say, how will I know that you are working, right? What is going to indicate your performance? And if they have those objectives and key results and key performance indicators very, very clearly set and defined, they understand what they are, they've agreed to them, then they have the opportunity to manage their own performance. They know exactly what is expected of them because they have a checklist right in front of them that says, if you are doing everything on this list, I have no need for concern. If you're not doing everything on this list, I'm going to reach out and we're going to have a conversation, right? So they're able to manage themselves more deeply if they are more clear on what their key performance indicators are for their role. So if you start with those KPIs and you refresh them often, you will have less need for performance issues. If the performance issues don't relate to the KPIs, just start with a conversation about performance expectations in general. This could be part of your remote work policy or not, but most of the time performance issues are just a miscommunication, that the manager has one expectation and the employee has a different expectation, and they're not aligned. So the more that you can create the time and space to have those conversations, align on expectations and say, hey, if I call at 3:00, I expect you to answer the phone. It gives the employee just the opportunity to say, oh, I didn't know that. I was in deep headspace. I turned my phone off. That's good to know. I'll keep my phone on during that time, right? Like little miscommunications like that are easy to escalate, but they're also easy to prevent. All right, next. This is a question from Michael. What are some of the best practices to limit distractions on a team level? Similar answer, actually. Really align on performance expectations as a team and record them in a remote work policy or a communication charter and say, all right, how do we all feel about dogs interrupting? How do we feel about children interrupting? How do we feel about, hearing sirens in the background? How do we feel about, going for a run in the middle of the day? How do we feel about all of that? The reason it's important to have that conversation as a team is because it's going to be different for every single team. A lot of people think that remote work culture is one size fits all. And it is not. You are going to have completely different employee experiences in one distributed team than you are in another distributed team. And so it's really essential to have those conversations as a team to align on those expectations and then to record them for future team members to understand. Because some companies don't care about interruptions. They welcome them and say, yeah, if your kid walks in, put them on your lap. They can join the meeting. We love it. Others have a strictly no children policy and actually require childcare even if you are working from home. So it's important to just articulate what expectations are and align on them as a team. All right, next one. Do you know of any tactics that we can share with our teams to alleviate procrastination in a way that it does not look like overmanagement or micromanagement? Good question. Micromanagement is very, very common in remote work because often when managers feel this lack of visibility, right? I can't see anybody. I don't know if they're working. Often they'll tend to over manage and over control by saying, I need to know what you're working on every single minute of every single day. And it blocks productivity and creates a toxic work culture. So this is a great question. I'm glad that you're aware of it, and I'm glad that you're asking. A lot of the things that we've already talked about in this video are probably going to help answer that question. The only thing that I would add to that is focus on benchmarks. So if we are moving into measuring productivity in a way that is results-based, which is very common in remote work, it's easy to get focused on just the result and not the benchmarks that lead up to the result. And in order to effectively and accurately measure true productivity and output, we need to be measuring all of those metrics equally. So, for example, if we are measuring the productivity of a salesperson, often we'll just say, well, if you make a sale, then that's how I know that you're productive. However, there are so many benchmarks that go into making a sale that also need to be measured to make sure that they are staying on track in order to achieve that final result. So things like conducting market research and networking at events and writing proposals and reaching out to cold leads and things like that. All of those need to be measured along the way. So those are the metrics that you can and should be including in your key performance performance indicators so that you're accurately measuring productivity, and they are also able to self-manage more accurately in a way that will help prevent procrastination. Great question. Okay, next this is anonymously asked. So someone asked, regarding boundaries, is it acceptable for the employee to set boundaries with their managers? We have issues with infinite meeting rooms that Skype and Zoom and Teams provide, and I know that several employees are being fatigued by being always on. Yes, absolutely. It's 100% acceptable to set those boundaries with your manager, and you should. However, how you go about that is going to really make or break your success. If you go to your manager and saying, this is your fault, I hate this, and you're micromanaging us, it's not going to end well, and you're not going to get the result that you want. However, if you go to your manager with suggestions for improvement, with data and metrics about why you think it's going to be successful, they're going to listen. And, this is How to Win Friends and Influence People, right? Like the most famous business book of all time. You've got to present your knowledge in a way that's going to set them up for success as well. So the more that you can present the topic in that way, the more that they will reciprocate. And so in this circumstance, you can say, I feel like our productivity is decreasing for this reason. Here are some examples. I'm worried that we're not going to be able to meet the expectations of the client because of this decline. I have some ideas. Can we collaborate together as a team to discuss? And typically what that looks like is setting aside only specific hours for meetings and then other hours for deep working time and independent time. The more that you can get into a groove of that ebb and flow of synchronous versus asynchronous work time, the more that your productivity will optimize as a team. All right, next question. Two questions combining that are asking about how do we create trust between employees, which we kind of already talked about, but more in the realm of doing drive-bys on productivity, as opposed to developing culture and interpersonal relationship. So they say, Chris is asking, you mentioned not needing to replicate being in a physical office, but on my team, we consider virtual situational awareness critical. The ability to drop in and talk to people and share quickly without typing a direct message is really important to our efficiencies. Most companies in this rush have focused on messaging and conferencing tools. What are your thoughts about situational awareness of our teams in this way of working? Another anonymous asker says, we can no longer actively walk by and view the productivity of our employees. It seems to shift our regular day-to-day and how we set reasonable goals, timelines, and establish practical escalation for corrective action. Both of these are really great questions. Again, I think a lot of what we've already discussed is probably going to answer these questions for you. However, let's zoom in a little bit more and figure out this dynamic of situational awareness and the drive-by visual cues of monitoring productivity. First, this is absolutely still possible, 100%. It is going to happen in different channels, right? Just like we talked about how onboarding is going to be happening in different channels, same concepts, same results, different channels. The same thing is true for drive-bys. So you're going to be leaning more heavily on tools than you're probably used to. That is your new key into visibility. When you want to just look over and see, has somebody accomplished the task that they're supposed to, we're going to use project management systems for that. So at any time during the day, you can jump into your project management system and see, all right, they're totally on track with all of their deadlines. They've completed these assignments. They haven't completed these assignments. I've got a general temperature check. In addition to that, you can also like you said, use direct messages. Hey, how are things going? You can schedule or not schedule quick calls that you just call them, say, hey, keep your phone on throughout the day. There might be some times that I that I call you, and you can check their calendar, see if they're in a meeting. And if not, you can just quickly call them up and say, hey, just checking on you. Is there anything that you need? I saw that you missed this deadline. I was concerned about it. We really need that by tomorrow. Is there anything I can help with? There are absolutely ways that we can still communicate with our team members, but remember that the goal here is communication and support as opposed to monitoring. So yes, you're not going to be able to monitor them. There are tools that do that. I don't recommend them unless they're necessary for regulation and compliance. So instead, focus on encouraging and enabling that autonomy, that they are responsible for their own results. You are there to support. And that reduces pressure off of you and puts you more into a role of I'm checking in on how I can help, as opposed to I'm checking in to make sure that you're working because I don't trust you. All right. Last but not least is a great question from Noel. I think this is the perfect one to wrap up on and conclude this supplementary Q&A with. He asks the question that I think all of us are wanting to know: do you think remote and work from home will become the new normal? Well, Noel, it's pointing to yes. So the current statistics are estimating that between 35 and 40% of the United States workforce will continue to work from home at least 2 times a week post-COVID. That is a staggering statistic, considering at the beginning of this year, at the beginning of 2020, that statistic was 3%. So we're going from 3% of the workforce all the way up to 35 to 40% in the span of just a couple of weeks and months. So there's a lot of work to do, a lot of catching up to do. However, I do think that a lot of people are focusing too much on the location. They're saying, okay, are we going to go back to the office, or are we going to continue to work remotely and work from home? And they're focused on, where am I going to work next? And as much as I do think that remote work is going to continue to be a growing trend, I don't think that it's going to I don't think that that's the right conversation for us to be having of, where am I going to be? I think that the future is less about where and more about how. So we're focusing more on having virtual first mindsets or remote first mindsets. We're focused more on digital infrastructures for resource accessibility. We're focusing on leveraging digital tools to increase efficiency and reduce travel time. Things like that. We're focused more on the fact that we can be productive and successful in our roles no matter where we are. So whether we're in the office or we're at home, regardless of our location, we can be just as successful in our role. That's what I think the future of work is about. It's less about where and more about how we are working. How are we engaging with our employees? How are we supporting our team members? How are we creating resources to be more evergreen and more accessible to more people? How are we doing that? Less about where are we doing that? Well, that's all that I had. All of the questions that were submitted in the Q&A for the webinar. So, like I said, great questions. I love that you guys are not afraid to get deep and ask the real raw questions. I hope that these answers and responses were helpful for you. As always, you're welcome to contact me directly or through the webinar hosts at Pluralsight. Both of us are happy to help facilitate this new concept of remote working for you and your teams. I wish you all the best.